In the darkness of the forest, where the rays of the sun never reach, there lives a terrible monster. He goes out hunting every night to find a new victim. No one knows what he looks like, but everyone has heard his screams and footsteps in the dark. One day, a group of friends went hiking in the forest. They didn't know about the danger that lurked in the dark. When they set up camp and made a bonfire, they heard strange noises from behind the trees. It was the footsteps of a monster that was approaching them. The friends tried to escape, but the monster was faster. He started hunting each of them, one by one. They ran and screamed, but no one could escape from his claws. When they found the camp in the morning, all the friends were dead. Their bodies were mutilated and mutilated. No one knew what happened in the dark of the forest, but everyone knew that a terrible monster lived there. Some people decided to check if all this is really happening in the monster forest. They went there equipped to the teeth and ready for any challenges. When they arrived in the forest, they started looking for traces of the monster, but no trace was found. They continued their search, but everything was quiet and peaceful. They decided to set up camp and spend the night in the forest, but nothing happened. No monster appeared. The next morning they returned home, disappointed and surprised by the absence of the monster. But there are those who still believe in the existence of a monster. They claim that a monster can only appear when people are not waiting for it to appear. Some people decided not to stop there and continued exploring the monster forest. They began to study its territory in more detail, installing cameras and traps. And then one day they finally saw a monster. He was huge and scary, with sharp teeth and fangs. But he didn't attack them, but just walked past them, as if he didn't notice them. This confirmed the theory that the monster appears only when people are not waiting for it to appear. And now they had proof that the monster forest really exists. Some of the researchers decided to continue their research, but with more caution, and others decided to stop there and leave the monster forest alone. But regardless of whether they continue their research or not, the monster forest will remain a mystery and a place that attracts curiosity and a desire to learn more. The Smithson family lived in a quiet town surrounded by a dense forest. They were ordinary people who never suspected what was waiting for them. One day, on the night of the full moon, strange things began to happen. At first, there were faint sounds, rustling and knocking on the walls. But gradually, these noises became louder and more threatening. Night after night, dark forces infiltrated the Smithsons' home. They heard whispers and ominous laughter, but when they checked the rooms, they found no one. It felt like the spirits were chasing them, watching from the shadows. The Smithson family was intimidated and harassed. They hired psychics and performed rituals, but nothing helped. The forces of evil only intensified. Every night seemed worse than the last. Their nerves were to the limit, and sleep and peace became alien concepts. One day, in utter despair, they turned to an old sorcerer about whom there were rumors in the city. He offered them a solution. According to him, they needed to find and hide an artifact that held power over these evil forces. The family went in search of the artifact, scouring the depths of the tangled forest paths. Along the way, they encountered ghosts and the dead who tried to stop them. But they didn't give up. Eventually, they found an artifact, a gloomy statue covered in dust and fear. They hid it in the deepest corner of their house, hoping that it would stop the darkness. But they were wrong. The darkness was stronger. She penetrated into every corner of the house and took control. The Smithson family was deprived of light and hope. They realized that they could not defeat evil and resigned themselves to their fate. Now, every night, the Smithsons' dark house is filled with malicious laughter and screams. Their souls are captured by these dark forces that will never allow them to leave this nightmarish world. Local residents, hearing about the terrible events that took place in the Smithsons' house, decided not to approach him. But over time, people began to doubt the veracity of these stories. They announced that they were ready to verify the veracity of these rumors and investigate the mysterious incidents that accompanied the Smithson family. A few brave souls decided on an expedition to the Smithson house. They armed themselves with flashlights, cameras, and recording devices. Gradually climbing the stairs, they felt that the air was getting colder and tension was in the air. When they entered the house, they felt that they were accompanied by invisible eyes. The sounds and rustling started again, but this time they were much louder and more eerie. Their lanterns flickered, and shadows played on the walls, as if they had come to life. While they were exploring each room, they found an abandoned room in the deepest corner of the house. The walls were covered with dust and cobwebs. In the center of the room stood a gloomy statue, exactly the same artifact that the Smithson family tried to hide. However, when they approached the statue, they felt their strength leaving. Sinister laughter filled the room, and the statue began to move. She began to radiate dark energy, enveloping the expedition. All their attempts to escape were in vain. The darkness swallowed them one by one. Imprisoned in this house, they realized that they were now part of this terrifying legend. Their souls were now tied to this house, and they became new victims of its sinister essence. Despite all the warnings and legends, some people could not resist the temptation and decided to explore the Smithson house even deeper. Among them was a team of paranormal researchers who were confident that they could unravel the mysteries of this place and find a way to free the captive souls. They arrived at the house armed with state-of-the-art equipment to detect signs of supernatural activity. The team included cameras, geophones, thermometers, and audio devices. From the very beginning of their research, they encountered unusual phenomena. Shadows moved along the walls. Devices began to register electromagnetic pulses. Their records were filled with mysterious voices and whispers. Diving deeper, the team found a hidden underground room that seemed to be the source of evil. Inside, there were walls covered in blood and ancient symbols. He realized that he was trapped and that his life could be in danger. A few minutes later, he heard the noise of the engines and felt that the plane began to fall. He closed his eyes and prayed for salvation. When the plane hit the ground, he lost consciousness. When he came to, he found himself in the hospital. No one knew how he survived the crash because all the other passengers and crew members died. Despite all this, the passenger could not forget about what happened on board the plane. He began to look for answers to his questions and conduct his own investigations. He turned to paranormal experts and tried to find witnesses to what happened on board the plane. He even tried to find other passengers who might have survived, but no one answered his calls and messages. However, after months of investigation, he received a message from a man who claimed to have been on board the same plane and seen the same thing as him. They met and exchanged their stories. It turned out that they both saw the same man in black, who spoke an incomprehensible language. They also saw shadows and heard whispers. They decided to continue their investigation together and found several more witnesses of what was happening. They gathered all their evidence and turned to the airline company that was responsible for the flight. The company conducted its investigation and came to the conclusion that something strange really happened on board the plane, but they could not give an explanation for what was happening. The passenger and his new friends continued to search for answers and investigate. They turned to experts on paranormal phenomena and conducted a series of experiments. They found that there was a high concentration of energy on board the plane, which could lead to paranormal phenomena. They also found traces of unknown substances on the passengers' clothes. Finally, they came to the conclusion that experimental testing of a new type of weapon that could cause paranormal phenomena took place on board the aircraft. The passenger and his friends shared their results with the world community and appealed to the government to stop testing such weapons. Their efforts led to the fact that the government banned the testing of such weapons and conducted an investigation of what happened on board the plane. The passenger and his friends received recognition for their efforts and became heroes in the fight for truth and justice. On the night of October 13, 1985, Train No. 666 departed from the Devil's Knee station in the direction of the city of Chernihiv. There were about 50 passengers on board, most of whom were young people going to a party in the city. A few hours after the departure of the train, passengers began to notice unexplained phenomena. They heard strange sounds and noises, saw shadows and figures that seemed unreal to them. Some of them claimed to have seen ghosts and even demons. Passengers began to panic and demand to stop the train. However, the train driver claimed that everything was fine and continued to move. The situation became increasingly tense when suddenly the train stopped at full speed. The driver tried to start the engine, but he did not respond to commands. Passengers began to get out of the cars to try to figure out what was happening. However, when they stepped onto the platform, they found that they were in a completely different place. They were surrounded by darkness and strange sounds. No one could understand how they got to this place and what happened to the train. Passengers began to wander around the neighborhood, trying to find a way out of this situation. They found a small town that seemed familiar to them, but they couldn't remember where they were. Soon they discovered that there was no one alive in the town. All the houses were empty, and the streets were filled with shadows and figures. Passengers began to panic and run in different directions, trying to find salvation. However, a few hours later, they were back on the platform where their train was parked. They boarded the train and continued on their way. When they arrived in the Blackpool, they turned to the local authorities and told about their adventures. Some of the passengers began to look for answers to their questions and study the history of the area. They discovered that the town in which they found themselves had been abandoned many years ago after a series of murders related to ritual sacrifices. It was also known that there was an ancient cult object near the town, which was used for conducting mysterious rituals. The passengers began to think that they were entangled in some mystical portal that transported them to the past. However, no one could explain why they returned to the platform and how they were able to return to their world. Some of the passengers began to look for answers to their questions in occult and esoteric circles. They learned about the theory of parallel worlds and the possibility of transition between them. They began to believe that they had been transported to another world that existed in parallel with their reality. Some of the passengers decided to return to that town to explore it in more detail and find answers to their questions. They discovered that there were real spirits and ghosts in the town, which were associated with the rituals of sacrifice. They began to perform rituals to summon these spirits and get answers to their questions. However, they did not take into account the consequences of their actions and could not control the power of the forces they caused. Their experiment led to the fact that they were occultly connected with these spirits and began to be persecuted by them in their reality. Some of the passengers became insane, others just disappeared. The remaining passengers realized that they should not have been playing with fire and resolutely abandoned their experiments. They returned to their reality and tried to forget about this terrible experience. But they will never forget that night when they were faced with what is beyond our world, and that you can't play with the power of supernatural forces.